Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for this AFN Network Plus webinar on the UK's civil resilience and preparedness for food system shocks with our speaker, Emeritus Professor of Food Policy, Tim Lang. I'm Jez Fredenberg and I'll be your chair today. I'm based at the School of Environmental Sciences at UEA, where I'm the Knowledge Exchange Fellow for the AFN Network Plus. If you've not joined one of our webinars before, it's part of a monthly programme, and AFN is a UKRI funded project focused on identifying research gaps that could help reduce emissions in the UK agri-food system. We've got 2,500 members now across the UK, so please join if you haven't already. We'll be putting links in the chat shortly. So also with me today is AFN co-lead, Professor Neil Ward, who'll be joining in the Q&A. Also based at UEA, and AFN project manager John Haslam, based at the University of York. So today's topic, I will let Tim introduce it properly in a second, but just to kind of set the scene very briefly, last week the UK government released its National Food Security Report, which painted, I would say, quite a mixed, maybe a little bit of a confusing picture, I suppose, about the status of UK food security. Tim, on the other hand, has spent the last 2 years trying to gain more clarity on all of this and really kind of looking under the bonnet of our national food system for a report for the National Preparedness Commission, which is soon to be published in a few weeks, I believe. Today, Tim is going to be sharing with us what he can about the findings from that research that he's been doing, as well as a lot of his other knowledge that he's built up over the years. So, of course, the other context this morning is that we've woken up to Donald Trump as US president and what that might mean for global stability, trade, climate, all of those sorts of things that affect the food system in the UK as well. So Tim will present, and then we're going to have an audience Q&A. We've got Tim until about 12:30 if there are enough questions. So please make the most of this time with him. Please put your questions in the Q&A box so that I can find them easily. We've got a lot of people on this webinar this morning, and if you put them in the chat box, I'm liable not to be able to see them properly. Please use that though for discussion, sharing of links, etc. So John, if you want to get Tim's slides ready, and I will just introduce Tim a little bit more. So Tim is obviously Emeritus Professor of Food Policy at, Tim, is this right, City of St George's?
City St George's.
St George's at the Centre for Food Policy, which he founded in 1994 and directed until 2016. He spent 4 decades researching, writing, advising and lecturing on the food system at international, national and local levels. He previously spent 7 years as a hill farmer, and his most recent book is Feeding Britain. I could go on, but Tim said keep it short, so I've kept it short. So Tim, over to you.
Thanks very much. And actually, the university is called City St George's. It merged last year, City University, which is one of the 1960s university, and we were in the part of the University of London Confederation, but we merged last year with the huge medical school at St George's. So the new name is City St George's, University of London. So we're all asked to try and bring that out. I've probably wasted too much time on that already. Anyway, thank you for this, Jez and Neil and everyone. I wanted to give a heads up to colleagues basically across the academic world about a report which I've spent, as Jez has said, over 2 years working on. Although I'm retired, this was something I was asked to do and did for a body no one's ever heard of called the National Preparedness Commission. Look it up. Started about 5 years ago by Lord Toby Harris of Haringey, whom I met 40 years ago when he was a leader of a London borough. 25 years ago, he went into the Lords and has had a very interesting career across that. He's a very broad-based person, and he and others from that commission sort of tapped me on the shoulder and said, look, we want someone to give us a sort of an overview of what do you think of the state of preparedness about food is. And I said, well, look, you're looking at the commissioners, and it's a very broad-based, lots of commissioners. You've got some very, very interesting inside track people. You don't need me. But what I would like to focus on is the public. I don't think really there's been much attention on the state of preparedness for shocks on the public. So we agreed basically that that's what I would do. And I, in my rash impetuousness of being a Capricornian and a breech baby, as my mother used to say, I thought I could do this in a year. Well, it's taken me 2.5 years because I basically run it a bit like a select committee. I've done rolling interviews. Very early on, those interviews, it was clear people who were in the know and very senior didn't want to really say what they thought. So I made a decision, which I don't regret, to anonymize it all. So you will never know who I interviewed, but I interviewed about 75 people, much more than any select committee would do. And I have tried to look at the scale of potential shocks. I don't see much about that. I'll talk more about that in my actual talk. But I was kept this focus on the public. I work in a public health department. I've always tried to, in my own personal working life and my colleagues at the Centre for Food Policy, we've always tried to focus on the public interest, the public health, democracy, society, all of these loose perspectives of social science. And although the focus I took was looking at the resilience system, there is, as you will see from me shortly, a national system of resilience, a resilience framework indeed. You can't unravel thinking about resilience, let alone practice in relation to resilience, unless you locate it in the context of key issues like food security, democracy, equity, the way the food system works, and all of those things that AFN members work on and have contributed to this explosion in Britain of very serious and very interesting work. And it's been the privilege of my working life to be part of that and see it grow from nothing to this. So I'm going to basically run you through some of the thinking that came out of my report. Literally, good social scientist, I didn't want to impose my own ideas on it. I said, right, I will start interviewing people. So literally 2 years ago in January 2023, I started interviewing people and said, do you think, the country is prepared for shocks? And a rolling system went on until I think my last interview was only about 3 months ago. And a very large report it has turned into, because I felt, and people said to me, we need to have this captured, you're doing all this work. And essentially a very big report is going to be published with a much more accessible exec summary. Both will be published on the National Preparedness website in September, in February. And with luck, you'll hear about it. So I look forward to the idea of it is to get that debate going. Next slide, please, Jonathan. I've done all of that, except the fourth bullet point here is really a major discussion that people like us have is the food system fragile or robust, or as I've put here, muddling along? I think it's muddling along, actually. It's neither robust nor collapsing, but it's much more fragile than we think it is. And a big theme of my report is this core idea of what the food industry has done in the last 50 years, which is to basically get rid of redundancy. They've tried to create Toyota management, lean machine food supply chains. And to some extent, they've done that. To some extent, they've made longer and longer supply chains. But the theme, the questions that I have asked, and I'm now reporting on in next month, is does this add up to a resilient food system? And one of the big academic thoughts I plant with you, colleagues, today is, do we really know what we mean by resilience? It's used all the time, and it sometimes drives me mad how vacuously it is used. It's a bit like food security. It's used to mean all things to all people. Okay, next one. I don't need to tell you, but I have to say this. We are talking about the food system. At one point, very far on in my research process, I was at a very closed meeting with some very senior people. I'm not quite sure why I was asked, but I was there. A sort of a 3-hour round table meeting. And at one point, the chair, a very senior person in the food sector, said, "Why do you people use this term food system all the time?" Well, I was slightly astonished, to be honest. And so I was thinking of not even having or leaving out a whole chapter I'd done on the food system and why it matters for resilience. And I thought this has got to stay in. Actually, there are lots of people who don't think like us. That there is a food system. So I've done a very simple model. This is from my report of sort of a flowchart approach to the food system. Next slide, please. Actually, it turns into this. There's that core flow from, if you like, nature to outcomes, but it's impinged upon. It's cut across. On the left-hand side, democracy and politics intervene. At the top, it draws upon nature and society and cultural inheritance and history. And on the right-hand side, there are interventionists who are doing things. 10 years of my life was working for think tanks and NGOs, advising local government at one point. It's a messy system. It's complicated. And at the bottom, you see the outcomes, the impacts, and the feedback loops. So there are many models, there are many very complicated models, but this is my attempt to try and do a relatively simple one. Next slide, please. Fundamentally, the point that came out from my interviewees was that the evidence is mounting that there are problems ahead and indeed upon us. Some people say they're ahead, others said they're in us. We're in it. Climate change, it's happening. It's climate heating is happening. We don't know where it's going to go. But the key point for me was, are the actions addressing that evidence with regard to resilience? The interesting thing, and for me, very, very, very interesting thing, when I interviewed very senior head honchos of the British food system, they were actually in no doubt the food system is heading for very difficult times. Some thought it was already in that more than others. But the point is, it's no longer just weird academics and outsiders who think that. It's not just scientists who think there are problems. It's not just climate change people who are concerned. It's not just this or that discipline. There is a picture of the food system in trouble. Well, why am I even having to say that? Because back in 2002, the former head of the NatWest Bank, in a big report for Gordon Brown, then the Chancellor of the Exchequer, said the NHS is in trouble unless you sort out the food system, in a very big series of reports, 2002, 2004. So why am I bothering to say this? Why am I wasting your time by saying what you already know? The problem is the food system is not changing enough. A little bit of a label here, a little bit of a tweak there, a very interesting attempts to reduce carbon footprint, removing plastic so the milk plastic bottle or plastic container of your milk is thinner now. And is that dealing with it? No, it's not. Everyone knows that that's not. But so I've just put it here very simply, the clock is ticking. Now, why does that matter? It's because the notion of food security that we've had is that food security is just about having enough food available. The evidence, next slide, please, John, is this term that we call the polycrisis. I mean, you can have a very complicated version of this. We're in a time of the Ukraine war, of the slaughter that's gone on in Gaza. Whatever your feelings about Israel and Gaza, take that out. Just on the food front, we're seeing how food can be weaponized and is weaponized. And are we surprised when Russia invaded for the second time Ukraine, and first things it did was to bomb the heck out of Mariupol? Why? Because that was where the Ukraine grain exports and seed and sunflower seeds and edible oils went out to feed 55 countries. The whole model of free flow globalization of food goods is now no longer fitting. We're in a time of polycrisis. We are in a time of the Internet of Things now being complicated, when 30,000 Houthis can add 15% to the food costs of shipping. This is a different world. This is not the world, but this is the world of just-in-time logistics. Next slide, please. And the dream of the last 50 years has been what I've crudely ringed in yellow there, of this sort of seamless, tight, efficient logistics flow from farm to that nice trolley at the retailer into the fork, and it's all very neat and orderly. And there at the top right is the Internet of Things, the Internet of the Sea, which is one bit of underpinning, but that's the same bit, bottom right, that is the Internet of War, is the Internet of drones, is the Internet of ransomware, and so on. And it's not just the Internet up in the air and satellites. Actually, it's the Internet, as we're seeing in the Baltic at the moment, quite regularly now, of cabling being broken as an act of aggression. What are the implications of that for food? Well, one of the things that it brought into line, as Chatham House, Rob Bailey and Laura Wellesley in their brilliant report 7 years ago, just showed how the choke points now of the global food system are coming into play. And their report pointed out 17 global choke points across the world in the food supply chains of internationally traded food, this is. Now 5 of those are in play as war. The Houthis, 30,000 Houthis, holding up the flow through to the Suez Canal. Okay, you can say, well, who cares about rice coming from India or whatever? Well, the disruptions that are there, and the spice trade and the tea and the coffee and so on, there's more than we think. But at the same time, the world of food, next slide, please, is dominated by this. In terms of security, I was born just after the Second World War in 1948. I was born into that post-Second World War rigorous, in fact, rationing still operating. No one wanted to have waste. And now we have this institutionalized waste that is so efficient, the outflow and the throughput of food, the overproduction of food, not the underproduction, the overproduction of food, is now turning into this premature slaughter of people that we call diet-related ill health. The diabetes type 2, the strokes, the heart disease, and then the drugs that are coming in, burdening the Ozempics and Wegovy's, will cripple the NHS and health insurance schemes. It's a side effect of the food industry. It's a side effect of the lack of control over marketing, the complete futility of labeling as a policy intervention, and so on. These are big issues coming onto the agenda that the long-term thinkers about food know is not being addressed, but if there was a crisis, they would have to be introduced, because suddenly waste is unacceptable in a way that at the moment it's normalized. And corporate power is now actually becoming one of the areas where there is most concern about this post-Second World War model of the food system that we've developed or has been developed with our involvement. The big food companies are now acutely aware of these challenges. If you just look at the World Economic Forum and its global risks, you see this sort of thinking creeping in there. Next slide, please. So where does this affect consumers? Remember, I'm focusing on public resilience. Well, there are lots of shocks that could affect them, actually. Next slide, please. My report goes into these. There are lots of things can be happened and are known to be going to be happening. There is a huge industry, which ought to be researched by people like us, on the ransomware, the attempt to protect companies. Who's protecting consumers on that? Well, there's an entire industry on trying to protect our laptops and our phones from being hacked, and yet the entire basis of them is to share information. There is every move I make will be being tracked by someone, and you too. In a sense, we need to look at the resilience of the food system in a world where that happens. And in extremis, we see this in overt conflicts. I won't put up a very detailed slide and table from my report, but I've concluded we really aren't and haven't thought through adequately the minutiae of what different sorts of vulnerability to these sorts of different impacts from shocks to the food system could have to the public. So what I have done, my contribution to this, for you people to pick up and run with if you want. You might think this is a waste of time. I don't think it is, and other people I know don't think it is either. We need to actually start unpicking different types of vulnerability. The vulnerability for a retired professor on a decent pension is very different to the vulnerability of a single mother on very restricted income who's having to juggle and go without food in order to feed her kids. And we know that's a big picture now. The Food Foundation data and so on, and indeed the government's own data, the Food Standards Agency's data, all point to this terrible problem we've got of vulnerabilities. But what would that do for shocks? We don't know. Next slide, please, John. I've tried to categorize the risks and threats, not just to put them down randomly. One of the reasons, I'll explain in a bit, is because I became increasingly unhappy about the official system of risk assessment called the National Risk Register, which in theory is the system that accounts for and says what risks face British society, from which defence should follow and resilience planning should follow. I'll be talking more about this later. And I just thought this was okay. Some of it's very interesting, but it wasn't addressing some of the threats and the possible combinations of those threats. And that top right, by the way, is a photo of what Russia did within 2 months of the 2022 invasion to Mariupol. And at the bottom, ongoing until literally last week, was gangs in Gaza raiding and looting the food aid coming into them. You get social dynamics get unleashed if food becomes uncertain. I was also in my report, I go into, I think, a remarkable literature that's emerging from inside industry, from industry think tanks, particularly from the insurance industry, who are really, really nervous about some of this stuff that I'm talking with you about, because they see it, particularly the reinsurance industry. This reminds me, I was talking with a close friend who was head of economics at Greenpeace way back. They started to get engagement with the insurance industry because they started seeing the possible difficulties of climate change and biodiversity way before the food industry was engaging with it. I think we're seeing the same thing again now, by the way. And there's some, I tried to do a summary of what business think tanks and business people are thinking in my report. And the IGD, a very well-known think tank to some of you, produced last year as I was, in the throes of my research, a big report saying 10 threats facing British food system. Well, they wouldn't have produced this. They know, they've told me that. They wouldn't have produced this 5 years ago. COVID, to some extent, shocked them into the possibility of fragilities. But one of the things, if you look at that report, it's a very good report, and I wrote to them, said, great, but you don't talk about the public at all. It's all about, as long as the supply chain's okay, the public's okay. But that's not necessarily the case. And there's a very interesting teasing out of how dynamics could occur. Next slide, please. Let me just get a bit clearer about what's meant by food security and resilience. And I thought a lot about this when I started, when Lord Harris asked me to do this 2.5 years ago. I sort of went, good academic, I went to the literature and started looking, what do we mean by resilience? Food security, I'm reasonably au fait with that literature for 40 years and keep up to it and contribute to it. But resilience, what do we mean by bouncing back from shock? What shock? Who's bouncing back? And there are basically different interpretations of what that means. Next slide, please, John. And crudely, on the left-hand side here is, consensus thinking on food security. It's about, and this is from the high, the top level people from the FAO, WHO system, that it's about those 6 variables, 6 features that need to apply of availability, affordability, access, utilization, etc., and the new ones thrown in by the Committee for Food Security in 2020 of sustainability and agency, particularly. But we talk about food security as something that emerges if you have all of those features. It's kind of an interactive circular relationship. Resilience, on the right-hand side here, is actually linear. Resilience is about a shock hitting a system and then the reactions. So there's a linearity. And this is, I thought, a very nice graphic from Chris Bene, whom I know and I've done some work with and for. I think it really is just very useful. Sort of trying to tease out what's the difference between food security and food resilience. Well, it's very different. Resilience is about this shock. Do you react to the shock? How do you react to it? What are the waves that happen from it? Trying to get clear about that. And there's pretty wide agreement that the shock happens, there are outputs, there's recovery, long-term, short-term dynamics, and so on. And there's a different language that we can pick out, but there are different dynamics. Next slide, please, John. Essentially, one of the things, before I go into this, actually, one of the things that comes out from the literature, to me, and I put in the report very clearly so that people like you take it apart and say, no, 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 he's missing something, is that while we all agree, whether you're an architect or an ecologist, the term resilience means bouncing back from shock. The issue that troubles, and my friend Tim Benton said this to me years ago, it's a question of shock and return to what state? I have a grandson who's an architect, they're trained, and he's an ecological architect. They don't want the building to fall down. It might be designed to wobble, designed to stand wind or torrential change, but they want it to stay in the same place. Unless it's, there's a whole new generation saying, well, no, we've got to develop houses that rise with rising waters. The Dutch particularly are interested in that. But to an ecologist, maybe the shock will mean plants that grow in this place won't be growing there in 100 years' time. They'll either have gone or failed to migrate it or disappeared altogether. To a psychologist, resilience is about personal characteristics. I trained originally as a psychologist, and in the post-Second World War trauma studies done by Bowlby and people, and the attachment and loss, all of those things about psychological and child development came out of studying children in shock. And can they cope with trauma? And resilience is about building for the long term. All these slides, by the way, seeing someone write, will be available with my report. So I'm saving you a lot of work. But this slide is something that I think I read as a PhD student in the 1970s, early 1970s. It was from the RAND Corporation. If you don't know the RAND Corporation, it's a breakaway from the American military, research and development, hence R&D. It's a very sharp organization. And Paul Baran in the early 1960s was asked to look at telecommunications. On the left, he said, look, we have everything going through hubs. There's a hub, it's at risk. That hub, it's at risk. What if we decentralized it a bit? There are 20 spokes, 20 little spokes at the end of that, what centralized one and one hub. What if we had 5 hubs? We can still have linkages between them and have 20 end nodules. Nodules would be a better word. But he said, well, let's take it further and let's make it what he called a distributed. And the more I thought about this, the more I thought this sort of thinking is coming back into play with the possibility of shocks. And as I put in the bottom of this slide, part of the idea of the internet was that it would get over this. There would be total connectivity between everyone to everyone. And at one level, that is the case, except it goes through certain key places. It goes through certain key pinch points. It goes through certain corporations. It's not actually distributed. It's highly centralized on a global basis, and indeed on a regional basis. So there are some very interesting, I think, unpicking. Neil, this is very, Neil Ward, this is very much both yours and my sort of type of interest. I reread the Stockholm Resilience Centre's 7 principles from 2015. Maintain diversity and redundancy. By redundancy, it doesn't mean jobs. It says you don't want lean systems. You want to have looseness into a system so it can build back from shock. So some bits of it may go, but other bits that a lean Toyota management or Tesco would say, well, that's a waste of efficiency. Get rid of it, cut our costs. For resilience purposes, that may be precisely what you want to have. So there are some really interesting tensions here between the way corporate capitalism, late capitalism, a late social democratic European Union has helped develop the food system over the last 50 years. But there are some common themes that come out of resilience. It's about foundations, it's about resources, it's about shocks, it's about dynamics, it's about outcomes, and it's about feedback loops. So we don't need to drown completely and just say it's all too complicated. Next slide, please. There is some very interesting literature from the disasters world. This is from one of those, the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction. A gang of people, Sargent here and colleagues, a few years ago came up with what they call the 5 S's, social model. I was interested in social resilience. I'm interested in the public. How would the British public, used to Tesco 364 days a year, 24 hours a day available, how would it cope if things didn't work out quite that way? The answer is we don't know. But there is some thinking there that really ought to be gone into and applied to it. Next slide, please. But time and time again, here's the psychology one. Let's skip over that. I thought I put it earlier, forgive me. Yeah, this one. Here's our friend, the Rand Corporation. Well, this is what they did for the Ministry of Defence in Britain, Rand Europe. No complexity about Rand ever. They like to deal with the complexity and then say, okay, cut to the quick, what do we do? They said, look, resilience is ultimately about preparation, how you deal with your response, and how you deal with recovery. At one level, it's very elegant, typically elegant from Rand. And under each of these 3 words are 3 sub-themes they think needs to be thought through. But I'm not sure that completely applies to food. I don't want to say any more than that. For now, anyway. It assumes someone's in control. Next slide, please. Is anyone facing this for food? Where is government in this? Remember, I'm doing my report for the National Preparedness Commission, which isn't government, it's theoretically a non-governmental organization, but it's full of the great and the good and people you've never heard of. But really interesting range of people all saying, is Britain prepared for shocks? And they've asked me to have a look at it. Okay, so I'm looking at it. So one of the first things I did was go and have a look at, well, what's the official line? Well, going back to the next slide, please. The Civil Contingencies Act, symbolized by that Queen Elizabeth II logo, in 2004, a Labour government created a Civil Contingencies Act. If you didn't know that, you know it now. And that came partly out of food. The shock that the British state and indeed food companies felt that a bunch of 1,000 lorry drivers could threaten milk supply by saying, we're going to blockade motorways and stop milk coming. Rumbles went through. Let me just save you a lot of time, but I've written it all up in my report. There was a system of civil defense in Britain, left over from the 1930s. It was wound down in the 70s and 80s. And back in the early 2000s, the then Labour government said, actually, we really got to fill something here. What are we going to do if there are civil contingencies issue? And to cut a long story short, on the right is the front cover of the latest. If you don't know this, your bedtime reading tonight, colleagues, is this. It's long and it's very interesting. I went to this expecting skepticism, and I didn't have skeptical thoughts about it by the end. And I've read it 3 times. This is the official government resilience framework under an incompetent, zigzagging Conservative government, I have to say. This is actually calm and clever and collected. It came out of the Cabinet Office, but imprimatur of the then Deputy Prime Minister, Oliver Dowding. It has 3 principles in red at the bottom left. Prevention is better than a cure in approaches to resilience. A whole of society approach must be taken and build a shared understanding of the risk. I completely agree with those. So what I did from very early on was start saying, is this what actually happens? And in reality, it filters down to something else. But on the left here, before I tell you that, on the left here is other bedtime reading. This is the National Risk Register, the latest edition. The Government Resilience Framework came out in the late 2022. This came out in 2023. This is, I think, the 5th iteration of a risk register. Hundreds of people, I don't know who they are because they're not listed, fair enough, apparently sit down and work out what risks face British society. Maybe some of you on this call contributed. I like to think that they all went for nice lunches and dinners and had a nice celebration, glass of wine and eaters, because food doesn't feature in it hardly at all. There are 89 risks facing British society, and only one of them is food, the possibility of mass contamination. So basically, I said, wow, this is interesting. This seems to bear no contact at all with the food system that people I know and in the literature and food people are beginning to tell me about. Next slide, please, John. And yet, under the Civil Contingencies Act, 2004, 21 years old, food was right from the beginning put down as a critical national infrastructure. What's meant by critical national infrastructure? Well, I started looking at that when I looked at my Feeding Britain book in Penguin. It came out the week of lockdown, sold out completely in a week. And now it's in its 4th paperback edition. And if you read that, you'll know I was pretty quizzical about this. Where's the food in this? Well, there was 1 page reported by DEFRA saying basically everything's okay. It's okay. But in 2020, the Lords, House of Lords, in a very, very heated ping-pong exchange with the Commons of the government of the day, the Conservative government under Johnson, said we must have a picture of food security. So into the Agriculture Act 2020 went this commitment to the triennial review. Jez, in her introduction to me, said the latest issue came out. It came out in the middle of December. The first one came out the day before Christmas in 2021. So not good for publicity. And this one didn't get much publicity either. But it's very important. There's a really important change of tone. The expert advisory group, I think, had an effect, and well done there. But the point of that food security review is that it doesn't do what ifs. It doesn't say what could happen. It's a snapshot of what is. And I've talked to the statisticians. Kelly Parsons at Cambridge and I appeared in front of, I think it was the Environmental Audit Committee or EFRA Committee, I can't remember which, and we wrote them a long paper about that, and that was then discussed by the DEFRA team doing the report. So we've talked with them, and at the York UK Food Security Food System Conference, we discussed it with that team. So, you can't say that the government doesn't have a system. What you can say is it's maybe not being applied or it's not being dealt with in a way that addresses resilience enough. Next slide, please. Here is a slide from the National Risk Register 2023, which looks at the 89 risks. Those are 23 of them listed on the right, under 9 themes listed on the left: terrorism, cyber states, threat state, geographic, accidents, etc., etc. And these are all numbered. The y-axis is impacts, the x-axis is likelihood. Well, the number one likelihood is another pandemic. But mass food contamination is in there somewhere, but in the bulbs, the sort of clouds I put in here, these are ones that thought to be fairly unlikely, but actually they've already happened. Sunk vessel blocks port. Well, we've had those. They're happening. Versions of that is happening with the Houthis holding up the Red Sea and so on, which has added 15% to food shipping costs. Next slide, please. So the public is having the impact of rising food costs. The fantasy of ever cheaper food, I think, is over. What about the public? Well, one of the issues about the National Risk Register is it's then translated into community risk registers. So every region has a community risk register. One of the things the Civil Contingencies Act set up, 2004 CCA set up, was a system of local resilience forums. Did you know they exist? I didn't either. I do now because I've surveyed them. These are all basically blue light brigades. Fire, if my house is bombed, I hope they will be there. My son-in-law is one of them, trained to come and take people out, drag them out, and look after them through very dire circumstances, not just paramedics, super paramedics. He's very fit. Now, the community risk registers essentially translate the big picture. So there is nothing about local difficulties of food poverty or dislocations or the difference between rural areas and urban areas and so on. There are 42 local resilience forums in England and Wales, 38 in England, 4 in Wales. And Scotland and Northern Ireland have sort of equivalents of food partnerships, risk partnerships, resilience partnerships. But these are not addressing the community in any sense that anyone who's read their World War II community activity around food would understand. Next slide, please. I've held this till now. On the day of the election, May 22, Oliver Dowdy, the person who signed off the government resilience framework that I think is pretty good, but just not applied to food, announced at a defence industries conference that everyone in Britain should store 3 days of food. And this is from it. It is from a body you've never heard of called the Emergency Planning College, a leftover of the Civil Defence College from the 1930s. And it's now part of the Resilience Directive in the Cabinet Office. And I phoned them up and said, a year ago, are you doing anything on food? Is there anything being done for the public? Oh, no, they said. Very nice, very charming. Said, no, we're not doing that. That's DEFRA. We only do this sort of stuff. It's all on our website. So, okay, are you sure? Okay. Wham bang, this came out from them. So maybe they just didn't want to tell me. But I said I was from the National Preparedness Commission, which knows the Emergency Planning College. And it's pretty vacuous, actually. Okay, not bad, but what does this mean if you're that single mum on a high-rise estate and really with great difficulties? Can you afford to get a first aid kit, hand sanitizer, bottled water, store 3 days of food, have a battery or wind-up radio, have a portable power bank, so on, and have all of that and not use it in your everyday life? I'm not sure. Has anyone done any research on that? I don't think so. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they've done a fantastic job. We'll see, because I'm sure they won't like what I've said. Next slide, please. No, actually go back. Sorry, John. So what I've done in my report, and I'm not going to say too much about it because I'm giving you a taster, I think there are practicalities that citizens can do. And there's a big theme that came out, not from social scientists, although it came from them too, the ones I interviewed, but it came out from ex-military, present military, and indeed senior people inside government and in the food industry. Everyone agreed there are things that citizens can do, but there's a limit to what can be done as an individual. And that's my criticism, actually, of this Emergency Planning College approach. It's very individualistic. One of the things we did get from COVID, and Mike Winter and colleagues' book, if you haven't seen it, from Policy Press at Bristol, it's a really nice book, Mike Winter at Exeter and others have written, looking at lessons from food system from COVID. One of the things that I think is really critical that you researchers need to get stuck into is the community basis, the social approach to resilience planning. And I've really tried to explore that. And there are at least 3 or 4 chapters in my report where I've looked at community gardens and different systems that are available that you might think are very peripheral. Indeed, they are peripheral at the moment, but come a crisis, they are no longer peripheral, and so on. So I don't want to go into that because it's all in my report. Next slide, please, John. What's really the picture I'm coming up with? Well, it's that quite significant changes are needed. There might be good planning at central government, but it's not percolating down in a way that makes sense to me as a social scientist, and I suspect to you if you did what I've done. And so what I've done in my report is actually have a 7-stage plan for the state of what it really, if it really wanted to have a whole of society approach, if it really wanted to apply prevention is better than the cure, if it really wanted to have engagement, here's what it should do. Again, I won't spoil my report by saying exactly what those are, but those will be outlined in the report. But the key point is we need to think more about what is civil support, what is community support, what could those community risk registers under the Civil Contingencies Act, what could they be if they included food? I have lots to say about that in my report and recommendations of how to breathe life into it. Next slide, please. One of the things that anyone who knows my work, I frequently take people back, and I do it to you now. How many of you have actually read the Hot Springs Conference report of 1943? This is basically where the world's post-Second World War food system was designed. And it's, if you like, the old approach to what I call in my report, total food defense. One of the really light bulb moments, well, no, that's the wrong analogy. One of the exciting moments for me was because I did with my colleague Natalie Newman a study, one about the 10 countries we looked at in our rapid appraisal system, is Sweden. It's close to the Soviet Union, as was. I used to teach Swedish politics, so I know a bit about it at one point in my life, comparing it with the Soviet Union, Britain, and the US. You know, I was interested, wanted to know what Sweden was doing because it's always interesting, and those eastern states are of Europe. And no one that I spoke to told me that this was happening. In 2022, literally parallel to me doing my work, the Swedish Government Cabinet Office had been doing something probably better and more central than me, because me is just me. Theirs was the Swedish state machine. And it's remarkable because, and I was very pleased, that basically it comes up with very similar conclusions to what my report has come up. I won't practice my Swedish, which is non-existent, but we can get good translations. The report is called Food Preparedness in a New Era. And basically it says we've got to apply, this is the Swedish government, the concept that they have in the military world called total defense, that an army may get smashed, but you rely upon the people. You're seeing that military politics in Ukraine, by the way. It's the people of Ukraine who are bolstering the military. Sweden says the same thing, and it calls it the concept of total defense. And I have said in my report, I think we need to apply and use theoretically and indeed practically the notion of what I call total food defense. What would it be like if small towns actually did grow food outside their towns? It could be just as allotment system, but why would they be important if the proverbial hit the fan? And Sweden is talking like that. And it U-turns on lots of things. It says we've got to do everything differently. We've got to have new storage systems, no lean machine for them, new storage of food in displaced areas. They've applied resilience thinking, as you would expect from a government which has the Stockholm Resilience Institute in its country. So there's lots of interesting stuff out there. Countries are thinking like ours hasn't been thinking about food. Next slide, please. Some of the things I did was spend time on the left. The 4 on the left is from I thought, a fabulous group, a collection of 160 households in Flint, the smallest county in Wales, indeed, no, other than Rutland, I think, smallest in England and Wales. Well, they got together, 15 years ago and started. They've got 3 big plots. They build solidarities. They share food. They're all members of it across this small area. Basically, the thing that comes out, the top right picture of them, is people get to know each other. They're building what that ghastly postman approach of social capital. In other words, people knowing each other. And here in a working class area of Edinburgh on the right, Granton, I haven't visited it, but I've talked to people from it. A stunning illustration of slow, patient build-up. They took over concrete and sort of dead grass areas around housing blocks and turned them into food growing. And it's ended up, look at that bottom right photo, big feasts, community building and people sharing and knowing each other. It's that solidarity that we know really makes a difference if there are shocks to the food system. People sharing, not going me, me, me. Next slide, please. And at a big scale, for very other reasons, many of us were interested in what happened with Detroit when it deindustrialized. This is in downtown Detroit, as some of you I'm sure know, turned into market gardens, what was industry or housing and so on. At one level, what have they got to say to London? What have they got to say to Birmingham? Well, they're showing that it's possible to do things differently if and when you have the need or you have the skills. That's it. Next slide, please. And others that people took me to, and I've been twice to Belgium to talk about, and just my last trip just before Christmas for my report was to Liège and having a meeting with the Wallonian group of food councils there, civil councils. They too have started building what they call the food belt approach over the last 15 years of trying to rebuild horticulture around the small city of Liège, deindustrialized, a Sheffield actually, a mining and industrial town. And on the right here, a photo from my longtime friend Rob Hopkins. This is from Grand-Sainte in the north of France near Calais. The mayor in all of these cities and towns have been very important, and they started ripping up the concrete around their council houses, their apartments, and turning them into small-scale vegetable gardens. I mean, this, you might say, the reason I put these up is because people like me would have, at this point, maybe put up some wartime parks being dug up and turned into allotments. Well, this is happening now. These are people wanting to do this. Next slide, please. Essentially, what is coming out, and I'm almost finished, Jez, what's coming out here is the need for reorganizational realignment. In red here, it's basically about what if. What if things happen? What if just-in-time systems aren't working? My report, by the way, is called Just in Case. And that's not my invention. I spent riveting times talking to the logistics industry, and they told me, look, Tim, we could do just in case, but it would need a reorientation. It would need something to be deliberate and framework set. We don't just do it. We've been told to get rid of redundancy. If you want to build it back in and build storage, well, we've got to do things differently, but it's all doable. Next slide, please. I think we've got to do what Sweden has done, re-inject defense into food security. Anyone who knows my writing of the last 10 years, I've been tiptoeing towards this. And when I interviewed people, some of the people were very clear indeed. So actually, it's not me, it's them. They have a system which I think is well deserves thought and learning from. It's about social infrastructure, is my story to you, my narrative to you. I think we need new legislation. We still post-Brexit, whatever you think about Brexit, and I thought it was crazy. We've built barriers between us and where we get 30% of our food. In terms of military terms, the docks and the Eurotunnel are highly vulnerable. Let me be very stark. It's a private army that runs the Eurotunnel. I'm not happy about that personally. But I think, next slide, please. we need to actually be, next slide, please, John. We need to do this sort of thinking. What do citizens in communities need as a food infrastructure for their own resilience? These are graphics. Gavin Wren, one of our ex-master student who's a graphic designer, has done for me throughout my report. Basically, we've got to get at the local level organizations coming forward. Now, those of you who say, well, we know that we've got sustainable food places. We've got the London Food Board in London. I know, I'm on it. I've been part of that. I understand it. But the point is, it's not everywhere. And what the Swedens and what the Baltics and what other countries have been doing is saying we need to have it more extensive. I think that's right. We need to have basically a better system. Next slide, please. I won't spend long on this because it's organogram. I like organograms. This is actually how the current CCA, the Civil Contingencies Act, works in Britain. There's an assumption at the bottom, there's a crisis event. And this system from the Cabinet Office and the devolved administrations going through the COBRA system and the Ministry of Defence will come in and will dig you out, get blue light brigades, get you to hospital, sort it out. Food doesn't feature in that, and it should do, across the 7 levels that I've got here, from central government to the community. Next slide, please. The reality from resilience thinking is there are going to be multiple crises at the bottom, and we don't have local civil infrastructure in an organized way. I'm speaking as someone who looks at the state. We should have. And so I'm proposing local food resilience committees. Some towns, some cities have got things that could act as those, but they need to be coordinated. They need to be doing that. Well, really, how good is our community risk assessment? How good are our community risk reports under the national risk analysis? And I don't think it's there, but I think it's doable, it's fixable. Next slide, please. I think those could be organized in this sort of way. This is a different version of the first organogram I put, where there are types of people you need to have on. I've had discussions with people, some saying, look, leave it alone. Don't make it formal. Let it be soft. Let it be run by communities in their ad hoc way. Okay, that's fine. But then when something goes wrong and the official structures kick in, even the chaotic Boris Johnson had to get organized and kick in official structures when COVID struck. If you don't have those connections between the messy community stuff and the official structures, well, you're going to be frozen out. And that's what happened in COVID. The community was frozen out and the systems didn't work well. And people were worsened. The craziness, in my view, I shouldn't use such language, the inefficiency, to be professorial, of cutting and closing catering industry when some of that catering industry should have been part of civil infrastructure for food in COVID. A rational system of civil food resilience would involve people who were frozen out by the ad hoc realities that went on in COVID. There was a food resilience industry forum. Government didn't have one. The industry suggested it. And so government said, oh yeah, let's do that. And they closed it down as soon as they could within 11 months. And people who were in and close to that told me in my interviews they thought that was a mistake. I agree with them. But I've said if we have something like that, it should be at the national level, should be much bigger than just the food industry. We need a National Council of Resilience or Security, I've suggested. So to conclude, Jez, next slide, please. It's the last one, I think. Next slide, John. It's that. Sorry. No, back. Sorry, that was it. I didn't see you moving.
John, we've lost your, I can't see your
That's it. That's it. What's the point of resilience planning? Well, the goal is to feed all people well. The reality of the Swedish report, I literally ran down my house yelling to my wife, look, the Swedes are suggesting what I'm suggesting. That's a law. The Swedes are putting through a law now on food security and resilience, where they're saying it's a duty on all mayors and municipalities to ensure in a crisis that people are fed. And when they discuss that, they say, the reason we're suggesting this is because if it's a law, it'll have to be pressure to have it happen. If it's just left, oh, we'll leave it to the voluntary sector. Give us a break. Rich areas will have it, poor areas will have it worse, or sometimes not at all. We've got to have it so there's some equity to it. That was the lesson of World War II. So I think, in a sense, I'm suggesting, as I very cumbersomely said in my report, the food resilience approach, if we want a civil resilient, food resilient system in Britain, we've got to wrap the goal of feeding all the people well, like the Swedes do, around a linked up approach to food security, food sustainability, food democracy, food defense, and food resilience, and the food risks and threats. And I make many, many recommendations in my report and specifics about it. So I'll stop there, Jess. Thank you, everyone, for the patience. I'm basically, if you want to go to the last slide, John, you can look at that later. But basically, I've tried to do a lot of regional studies, towns in Britain, drawn upon them, looked at different areas and said, look, we can get going on this. It's not going to be quick to do. Jez, I've given you a long input there. I don't apologize because you've had 2.5 years in 1 hour, actually in 50 minutes.
No, that was brilliant. Thanks so much, Tim. We had really lots of lively discussion on the chat as you've been going, lots of people involved in these more local groups, which is really interesting to see. I'll come to people's questions in a minute because there's quite a lot for me to read through. But I wanted to just kick off with a question around, you sort of talked about social capital and the importance of that. And
it's a term I hate, by the way.
okay.
This is part of the diminution of social science, that everything's reduced to capital. It's nonsense. Just talk in social relations.
Okay, so the importance of social connection and social relations, let's say. Yeah. I suppose the last time when the UK had to suddenly sort of up its game and sort of become more resilient in terms of food was obviously Second World War. I was sort of wondering, how does the kind of social fabric of the UK, because it has changed quite a bit, I would say, in terms of the dynamics of how we work, what we work in, our family structures, all those sorts of things. How does all of that kind of play into how we might be able to react or not and sort of become more resilient?
Well, Jez, apply for your PhD and do it. It's a great question. The answer is we don't know. But rest assured, one of the reasons I left the chapter about the food system and British society in my report is because I think you're spot on. You're right. We don't know how that would look. We've had a few indicators at little moments of crisis, COVID being one, but COVID, when WhatsApp groups, my own street, people hardly, I'm in London, in the London, there's actually quite a sociable street at one level, but a lot more engagement went on and has followed on, and people fall out over politics. It's still now. How would that work when it came to sharing food if there was a crisis? What if the internet went down, Jess? My God, your age group, you wouldn't know what to do. You wouldn't. There's no social life, disappears overnight. I jest. So we don't know. We just don't know. But all I know is, looking at other countries, some of them were thinking like that. And I will never forget, to my dying day, which I hope is not a long time ahead, I was in the embassy of one of the countries we were looking at, and it turned out the person who had done their planning was there. And it was a great big room in a grand building in London. And this person was the other side. I can visualize him coming. He was over there, and he was a lawyer. And he said, do you want me really to tell you what I think went on? I said, yes, I do. And he just ran out of the room. I thought, my God, have I upset him? Came back with a mountain of stuff and came and sat next to me. He said, look, this is what we've done. I've spent 6 years on this in my country, developing a system down to the local level of cards, not relying on the internet. That'll go if Russia invades us, he said. There will be no government if Russia invades us. This is a small country, by the way. We will be wiped out. So we've had to actually go to our people and say, look, What would you do? Here are some things you can do. And they've done, you know, if we like it, done focus groups and community discussions with mayors and town councils. What do we do in Britain? We've got this highly centralized state. You know, when I taught social policy, it was the Soviet Union, China, and Britain in terms of centralization of state. We won't give mayors in England the equal powers. We have eviscerated parish councils. What community councils? You know, well, there are really interesting groups, Citizens Action, Citizens Advice, sorry, Neighborhood Watches. These are really interesting organizations, but they're not institutional structures that can fill the gap. But I think people like that need to be brought in. I've begun talking to them, by the way. So I think your question is an incredibly important one, Jez. And it's the sort of thing, geography and social department. Neil, you're too old. We're too old, dear boy. But we ought to knock 40 years off us and apply for PhDs in this. This is something we should be looking at. Let us go back in our history, Chaz, to the 1850s, to the Chartist movements of the 1830s. Let us go back to all the co-op movement. I used to walk, I lived in Rochdale, and I used to walk past where the Rochdale first co-op was in Toad Lane, now a museum. And, you know, those are people just got themselves together and started organizing. It's actually, in the end, it's about organizing. And in one of my 75 interviews, turned out, person I didn't know, but working in the state, was ex-military, and said, look, the individualism is incredible, Tim. And I said, it's all me stuff. We know, you know, my training, this is this guy saying, my training is, it's about people together that matters, whether you're in the army or not in the army, it's about people together. So what structures would benefit civil social resilience is how I would translate your question to me, Jez. But you're absolutely right. You know, I wish I was young again because I'd like to get stuck in on that. How could you get, is it neighbors getting neighbors together? Is it, that's the way? Would we organize around streets? You know, look at the street party system. Maybe that's a starting point for modern society.
No,
I don't know, Jez.
yeah,
It's a brilliant question.
it's an interesting one, and I think you were earlier on. You were talking about how like the need to sort of pick out how different people and the vulnerabilities of different people might play out, and the sort of things that might happen in a really big shock. Um, yeah, so I don't know. I wonder whether you wanted to say anything about that, because that I thought that was quite an interesting point of trying to understand. Again, it's those sort of social dynamics, isn't it? And what happens
It
when you've
is.
got some people who are, like you said, not so vulnerable to those shocks. But then, as we know, with COVID and with increase in food prices from Russia and everything, we know lots of people have been much more vulnerable.
Correct. The short answer is, look, I mean, when I stopped farming in 1980, distraught about it for all sorts of reasons, I got stuck into a school food campaign against the Thatcher 1980 Education Act, which was removing nutrition standards from school meals and trying to lead to contracting out. And I was actually, to be honest, horrified. So I cut my teeth actually in food policy writing really about that. And one of the things I learned from that was that having standards and having people together and having some institutional infrastructure really matters. And it switched my course to what I've done for the last 45 years. And I mean, I can't answer your question. I'd like to hear other people's. I've talked enough, I think. But you know, you're right to raise this. There's so much, and I shouldn't apologize as an academic, but my report is huge, because I kept on saying to people and people who looked at it, you know, should I cut this out? And I said, no, it's really interesting. And other people think, well, I know that. I said, but other people don't know that. And that's the problem we have. Civil food resilience requires all of us to actually be interdisciplinary, you know, and whatever I've done in my life, I've danced about a lot and covered across disciplinary areas. And I don't apologize for that. To hardline economists, it looks like, you know, we're generalists, but actually this is where it becomes really important, because food is all these different things at once. It's not just capital. It's not just social relations. It's material, it's ecological, it's biological. all of that. So you're
But
right.
yeah, so there's a question here from Christina Biggs, which sort of feeds into that, about, like I say, linking food to energy. She's talking about, have you kind of looked at, or perhaps in the Swedish example, they're looking at energy resilience in the event of power cuts. Who's talking about solar panels, solar batteries locally? What about food processing? All of those things are obviously powered by energy.
Yeah. Again, good point. What I mean, I'm showing what a complete bore I am, but then as a professor, we're supposed to be boring. But there are endless acronyms in my report, and there is a very good glossary. I really worked hard to make sure anyone could look it up at the back. But there are numerous government bodies that, if you're a geographer, you'll never heard of, but matter to me. SACN, Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, for example. I mean, that should be asked to draw up different dietaries. I'm sorry to get it heated about it, but I think that ludicrous store 3 days of food. How? Where? In a freezer? What if that goes off? First thing that I talked to some head honchos in the US, well, actually, energy outages. One of my nephews was being moved by the LA fires, telling store 3 days of food? Really? What if you get moved out because your house is on fire? What good is that? Well, it's the community, stupid, is what people said to me from very surprising places. And energy is right. You probably don't know, but I tell you in my report that a year ago there was a massive exploration by the British state called Operation Mighty Oak, looking at what happens if energy collapses. The answer is a lot happens, Jess.
I bet, yeah, absolutely. Well, I just wanted to move us across to land itself and the availability, sort of access to land. The question here from Richard Edwards, related to farmers, saying, designing new food economies like short food supply chains, connecting communities with farmers, requires some level of support from government. That's what he's kind of saying. But I guess the question is around also, how can farmers and landowners be brought into creating more resilience?
Yeah, well, again, a great question, Richard. Absolutely spot on. I've tried to address that, and I stopped worrying about whether I dealt with things adequately and just decided, well, I've done my best, and it's for people to pick up and run. But I actually spent couple of days talking to two very, very big landowners. And one said, look, Tim, we'd be up for opening up more of our land as allotments. But, that needs working through. This is astonishing. But is there any point somewhere in the middle of nowhere saying, well, okay, come and have some allotments here if people got to get in a car and go there and do it? Well, actually, anyone who knows their Russia, which I do a little bit, that's exactly what they do, going to the dashas. And I will never forget to my dying day in Archangels in Russian, up near the Arctic Circle, going to Soviet era collective farm and 50 kilometers from Archangels through this extraordinary forest, nothing but bears and swamps, and indeed one prison, one gulag, that you could push the fences over, and the driver said, but where would they go to, Tim? I've never forgotten that either. The most beautiful gardens. These people knew they depended on their gardens. We don't. We depend on Tesco et al. What if that goes slightly awry? I don't know. We need to actually explore the one Ministry of Defence study done by Cranfield University, 2007, I referred to it, said, look, it's okay if one regional distribution centre goes down. Tesco's got 14 others. Now Tesco's got 20. Actually, there's a really interesting table, it took me a day to do, of where I've totted up all the DCs, distribution centres. Go back to that Paul Baran 1962-64 slide I put up of centralised, decentralised, distributed. There are actually 131 distribution centres feed Britain. It's only 131. Now, I'm not military at all, but if I was military, I think, oh, look what Russia's doing in Ukraine, knocking out its power centres.
Yeah, it wouldn't be too difficult, would it?
Wouldn't be too difficult. And
There's-
I sort of felt 2 years ago, I thought, oh God, I can't say this is secret state stuff. Is it? Heck, it's about feeding the people. I'm a fellow of the Faculty of Public Health. It's my duty as a faculty member to say, dear public health, I want directors of public health. I'll be clear with you. I want directors of public health to help set up local civil food resilience. They are local people with local environmental health officers. We need to have people who are in the state, have legal obligations to bring their expertise and knowledge to and with the communities and the local organizations and the sustainable food places, time the Fix Our Foods and the fabulous groups in Wales, by the way, really, a network of 22 food partnerships coordinated from and by and with Cardiff, and they're motoring in this sort of thinking at the moment in Powys, in Carmarthen, and Monmouth. There's really interesting work going on, and I basically think we've got to expand that, but it's got to have some official structure, is my view. I mean, ignore me, and my report is not an official report, Jez. You've got to pick up and run with it, all of you. But I make a big appeal as a Londoner, as someone on the London Food Board. The only public engagement I have is as a member of the London Food Board. And I've declared an interest. There's I do a study of London and how it works and what we learned from COVID and what we did before COVID. But because I'd helped get talks between the Resilience Forum for London and the London Food Board. So we actually had connections before COVID, but they weren't good enough. We'd started trying to map the food system of London and we couldn't do it. We didn't have the data. I got a whole group of senior food industry people to come and meet the mayors and deputy mayors. And we tried to work it out and we couldn't. So we had to step back and start doing other things. Well, that's unacceptable. So this is the biggest city in Europe, doesn't know where it gets its food from. Or how.
And are you saying that only by having that sort of organizational element to it, that's how you ensure that that more disadvantaged groups are
I
included?
am. I
Yeah.
am. Jez, go, if I was up in my study, I'd now be pointing behind my back to the things that I read that influenced me. In 1936, William Beveridge, known now as the father of the welfare state, Beveridge came back and wrote a report. He was an agricultural economist by training, and he was the permanent secretary at the first Ministry of Food in 1916. And any student of mine will be now yawning, because I always say the best book ever written on food policy is his Official History of World War One, where he basically describes what happened, what they had to do. It's so clear. He was brilliantly clear. And in 36, he came back and said, look, we need to get better prepared. And what do you think happened to his report, Jez? He was ignored. And the thing that the Brits who say, oh, aren't we brilliant, we beat the Nazis, whoa, from a food channel, I tell you, if the Nazis had come through and followed up after Dunkirk, Britain was wiped out. It was producing a third of its food. Would Britain be okay if it produces 60% of its food, which at the current statement is 58%? Well, I think British public would find it very difficult to cut its food by half. And I think that 58% figure is heavily overweighted by the hidden ingredients that have traveled between and across borders and have got, soya from Brazil or this, that, and t'other, and energy from Norway. I don't think Britain is in at all prepared state of affairs.
And of course, we wouldn't have hardly
and
any.
So, but the one thing, to now answer your question in one sentence, if you don't apply an equity principle, you create social dynamics that lead to what we see in Gaza: the poor attacking the poor, the dispossessed attacking the dispossessed, and we know that happens. Why would Britain be any different to that? It wouldn't be.
Neil, I wanted to bring you in. You had your hand up earlier. Did you?
Yeah. Just a quickie, Tim. We've got this legal target of net zero by 2050, and I just wondered, your analysis and your prescriptions, do they wholly help go with the grain and reinforce the transition that
They do.
everyone's thinking
Yeah,
about?
they do.
Or are there any areas where there might be a tension between reducing net greenhouse gas emissions and resilience and security?
That's a very good question, Neil. I haven't done a whole chapter on that, but energy. Look, I was the last natural resources and land use commission for the sustainable development before the Tories in DEFRA abolished it in 2011, and I have that written on my brain. And one of the things I thought was really encouraging from my interviewees was, and I repeat, I knew some of them, but I didn't know lots of them, was how consistently people came up with what the Sustainable Development Commission used to argue, which is a secure system has to start off as a sustainable system. You can't separate net zero or biodiversity targets from resilience planning. You're wanting nature to help resilience as much as social resilience has to come from how society is organized, and the issue that Jez was raising of income distribution. And Jez, should have said it, and there's lots of sections in my report. One of the really unpalatable things I've tried to address is rationing. Because of rationing, of course, is the equitable distribution of food. Markets do not distribute food rationally and equitably. It has a rationale to it, but it is not in public health terms. And I'm speaking as a public health person here, or my public health hat on. So it's a good question, Neil, is the answer. I think we do need to look for tensions between it. But I think my last but one slide was trying to say, look, unless you have a Trumpist government in Britain that says, forget net zero, throw it away, we don't need it. I don't know if you know, but Trump has withdrawn from the WHO, the World Health Organization. I mean, that's just shocking. But he's also torn up the Paris Agreement. Okay, we're not winning on the Paris Agreement, but at least notionally it's a benchmark. I think it would be a foolish government, a Labour government, and maybe it will be foolish. It would be a foolish government that ignored the transition to sustainability of land use in Britain. But at the same time, resilience in the people has got to address that. So, my argument with my many friends in the environmental movements or environmental academics like yourself, Neil, is that the environment should not be at odds with society. We have to integrate. And the thing about food, as it goes down people's life, is both the environment and health and society and meaning and religion and culture and semiotics. It's all of those things. So, but I would say this, I'm a policy man. If you don't organize it, it's messy and the powerful win.
Thanks, Tim. And one last question from someone who's anonymous, but I think it's a really important one, saying that the category, the risks and threats listed in your presentation continue to have a profound effect on the UK farming sector. Resilience is not without limits. How do we ensure that farmers are seen and recognised as part of the solution and supported? So I guess, yeah, it's a wider question, isn't it? Again, about how farming can how the resilience can extend to the farming sector, and I think the communities that are around those farmers and the sort of farmers that are part of those communities.
Well, all I say is read the section on Wales in my report, because Wales has got the only growing horticultural sector. In fact, yesterday I was with a dear friend of mine I share a near birthday with, who basically is in critical care and might be dying, with his children, and one of whom is now a small farmer in Wales. And it's just wonderful how, because of that structure and the existence of small holdings, it's the only area where there's a growth. And we're not thinking like that. And that applies whether it's small shops, small farms. I saw someone putting up a question about small shops. This is back to that central point about resilience. Mr. or Ms. Anonymous and Jazz, we've got a highly concentrated food system. We've got 9 companies that sell 94.5% of food. We've got the catering sector that sells 30%, so it's only 94.5% of that, 70%. But the last government took out hospitality. in COVID. We mustn't make that mistake again. There are different pathways, different supply chains, different diversities. And one of the things, dear Farmer Anonymous, I would like to see is more farm to catering establishment supply chains. You would build in diversity more if you think more systemically about food. And I think that maybe I'm wild and optimistic, but I think that will come only if you have you devolve more powers to regions. What is it about England? It's because it's an empire, seeking an empire still. We've got to cut this empire legacy of central control and give more devolved powers and do it in a systematic way. And I think food is a way of cutting through that, actually, because even the rich eat.
Brilliant. Tim, thank you so much. It's really interesting because I think it challenges us all, really, doesn't it? Especially as an English person, I think it's very easy to think in a very centralized kind of top-down kind of way. So I think, yeah, thank you so much for that presentation and answering everybody's questions. Lots to come. Your report is out in February, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, I'm not, forgive me, I'm not, this sounds very controlled because I've actually spent the last year going and talking with groups. But with this one, I've been very frank, so you know actually quite a lot of some of my thinking, but you don't know a quarter of it, I assure you. But the recommendations are very important. If you get the report when it comes out, have a look at the country studies. That's in chapter 6. The first part you probably mostly know, but you won't necessarily know the stuff on resilience. There's well, even Lord Harris really loved a section on the timeline, the development. I've done a sort of 6-page timeline over the last 40 years of the development and non-development of thinking up to the present. And I'm trying to pull together people like us, AFN. I'd be, I'm in your world, part of it, and proudly so. But there is a defense world which has been out there and totally disconnected from it. And they're actually interested in us. And we haven't got pathways to them. And I think the risk and resilience arguments are actually very important potential links. But we know things they don't know, and they know things we don't know. So I see, that's why my last graphic slide, please look at that very carefully indeed, because I do not see us building civil food resilience in any country. This comes from my looking at other countries in this study, unless we integrate that thinking. Yesterday, very early, I was on to a group of business people in Belgium who'd heard me in Liège and met me. Who said, look, we agree with your analysis. We just agree. We think our food system is fragile, but we're in the European Union. We need to do this rethink. The origin of the European Union, 4 things: steel, iron, coal, food. Food then seen just as agriculture. Now, 70 years later, we know food isn't just about agriculture. Agriculture is on its uppers at the drop of a hat if Russian gas went, as it did. Liquid gas from the US and the Middle East. Really, is that secure? Don't know. I know what I think, but that's not for me to say. So I think there's a bit of humility needed here. And it's not about building bunkers and having storage under your bed. That may be useful. I don't want to gainsay Oliver Dowden. He was elected, I'm not. But saying to people, people in Britain stole 3 days of food, that is not necessarily the sum of what needs to happen for civil food resilience. It's dreadful, Jez. It's dreadful. Dreadful.
It's not really up to scratch. Also, I mean, a shock will normally last more than 3 days. So, yeah.
Well, let me end on a nice note. Trying to think through, how can I deal with this issue of storage? Because it kept on coming up in my interviews, and I've woven the interviews all throughout the report, by the way, so to both lighten it and show that this isn't my views; it's the views of my interviewees. Me trying to piece it all together, and at one point I deviated off and spent a day looking at the Mormons. The Mormon Church recommends the longest storage that I can find. Although actually Switzerland last year passed a law. Switzerland, which has for years had a 3-month storage, a state storage of 3 years food.
Okay.
It does. Well, now, Jez, you're out of date because it's 1 year. They've passed a law to turn it to 1 year. But there's a big political fight going on in Switzerland. My advisors tell me that. So I don't know. But the Mormons say you've got to store at least 3 months, but they give detailed account, and they got their own university to do a nutrition analysis. And it's the most developed analysis I can find. The Mormons, But so one of my recommendations is I think we need SACN, the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, to actually come up with different dietaries. If they want us to store, they want us to collectivize storage. And could we have collective storage? One of my proposals, to dangle a carrot here, is the food bank system should be turned into community storage. They want to make themselves obsolete. Great. They're a scandal. They know that. They shouldn't exist. They're good people. They're sticking plaster being used by the state as incompetent, sorry, not incompetent, inadequate sticking plaster. Turn them into community food storage.
Interesting. Well,
So
Tim,
I've got lots of ideas in there.
yeah,
But,
brilliant.
if you go to the Mormon section, it was.
Yeah, we'll look out for
just,
that. Brilliant, Tim. Thank you so much. And yeah, we will definitely look out for it. If everybody signs up to AFN as well, I will make sure that we will email it out to everybody on our list. So yeah, sign up for that. We'll also be putting this video online, so I will send it around if you want to watch it again. And we're also going to be writing it up as a briefing, so we can like draw out your key points and
okay. And thanks. Jez, can I interrupt? Sorry, I'm a terrible interrupter, as everyone in my family knows, all my students know, all my friends know. I hope this has been okay. I've poured a lot out at you, but my job is as, what we used to call a public intellectual. I think our job is not to just write learned articles, although I've spent my working life trying to do that as well. But, this is in the public domain, so it's yours. It'll be yours. The report will be for you, Welcome to the 850 references I've read.
Oh my gosh. No, thank you. We'll pull some more out of it, because it sounds like you say, there's a lot for academia, researchers, policymakers to really go at.
Yeah. And pick up and run with it.
Yeah, and connections to be forged and everything.
Yeah, good. Thank you for inviting me, Neil and Jonathan, for doing the slides. Thank you. Oh, Jonathan's got the nicest wallpaper. In a former life, Jonathan, I used to sell wallpaper. When I left school and didn't know what I was doing, I sold wallpaper. I love wallpaper. So you have all the key wallpaper. There you go. Now you know.
There's a Tim Lang fact we didn't know.
Yeah, there you go. Well, we've all got lives. Okay.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks,
Bye-bye,
Tim.
everyone.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Good wishes, everyone.
Bye.
How do I get out of this, Jez? Oh, I think you closed me down.
I'm just gonna.
Yeah, there we go. Okay.